Today I want to tell you the story of Joyce Brown, one of the most famous stories in psychiatry and in bioethics. Joyce was a 40-year-old homeless woman who appeared mentally ill, living in 1987 on the streets of New York, and specifically the Upper East Side, where rich people live, and not very far from Gracie Mansion, where the mayor of New York, Ed Koch, lived. What ensued was a kind of political battle, Koch versus Brown, and also a battle about labeling, involuntary commitment of the homeless people, and their rights. I'm Gregory Pence. I'm a bioethicist at the University of Alabama at Birmingham, and this is Great Stories in Bioethics. Back up a little bit, it's always been a problem for compassionate people to see homeless people living on the streets, especially if they appear mentally ill. It seems they'd be better off in an institution someplace where they would have clean sheets and food and access to drugs and psychiatrists. That was the idea behind Project Help, which the City of New York started with Mayor Koch's backing. And the idea is we're going to pick up these homeless people sleeping in Central Park in the winter and put them where they're going to be much better off. Mayor Koch actually suggested Joyce Brown would be a good test case because he sometimes walked by her and spoke to her. And certainly Joyce Brown appeared to have problems. She looked disheveled. She wore the same clothes for months. If people balled up money and threw it at her, she picked it up and threw it back. She talked to herself. She sometimes sang songs to herself. She was accused of urinating and defecating on the gutter. I lived in New York City for 4 years, and there aren't a whole lot of public restrooms in New York City, and they, at the time especially, they tend to be in subways, and the Upper East Side doesn't have a subway close by to where Joyce was. Of course, you can go into a department store like Bloomingdale's and use a restroom, but Joyce Brown, probably not going to be admitted to Bloomingdale's. Unfortunately, urinating and defecating on the streets is not itself a sign of mental illness. Joyce Brown was picked up by a van, kind of like the ICE van that's used today, taken against her will to Bellevue Hospital, where against her will she was given Ativan, a benzodiazepine, and Haldol, an antipsychotic drug. She was then taken to the 18th floor, a locked unit for psychiatric patients, and committed against her will. Joyce was savvy enough to call the New York branch of the ACLU, which agreed to take her case if she would agree to publicity to use her case as a symbol for the plight of homeless people committed against their will. A hearing occurred before a Judge Robert Lippman. Two psychiatrists who really hadn't known her very long, testified that she was obviously schizophrenic and should be committed. Two psychiatrists for the ACLU said she was not schizophrenic and did not meet the standards of O'Connor versus Donaldson. So O'Connor versus Donaldson is the key US Supreme Court decision here. It basically talked about the kinds of laws that states can pass to involuntarily commit people who have not committed a crime. Basically, what had happened is that a young man in Florida had an argument with his father. Father had him committed, and this young man had spent decades in a mental institution in Florida until finally some lawyer took his case and went all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said, no, this can't happen unless the person has a diagnosable mental illness, as defined by the American Psychiatric Association's DSM. And secondly, there's a dangerous condition. The person has to be dangerous to others or to himself. Later, they also added, the person has to commit an overt act signifying danger. No one thought Joyce was dangerous to other people, but was she dangerous to herself? The city argued that sleeping on the sidewalk in New York City winter as a 40-year-old woman was in fact dangerous to herself by the fact itself, ipso facto. Joyce countered that shelters were dangerous for her. She had been attacked by women there. Shelters were not always clean. She felt safer actually on the streets of New York City. So Judge Lippman actually interviewed her, as the ACLU argued also. He found her lucid and coherent, that she did not meet the standards of O'Connor versus Donaldson. The city appealed, and at first it seemed like they had won because an appellate court backed the city. But then, when Bellevue Hospital tried to medicate her, it turned out New York had a law that required an even higher standard to medicate someone against their will. New York City couldn't meet that higher standard. So Joyce was released and proceeded to have her 15 minutes of fame. She dined on Windows of the World atop the World Trade Center before it was blown up. She was on the Phil Donahue show, a national talk show. She was on 60 Minutes. She even went up to Cambridge and was interviewed at Harvard Law School as a spokesperson for the homeless people. But after a couple months, She was again seen on Times Square, angry, singing to herself, sometimes having bad interactions with tourists, did not seem to be doing very well. At this point, the media kind of lost track of her. I followed her case for another decade. She seemed to be in various homes for women, for psychiatric homes. She was up in Westchester County for a while. At some point in following her case, I got in touch with a psychiatrist who had also followed her case. He wasn't really clear about how he had been involved, but obviously been involved in her case in some way. And he disclosed something that was really amazing. Psychiatry finally decided that Joyce had never been schizophrenic. That label had been wrongly applied to her. Her problem all along had been drugs. Her sisters had testified before Judge Lippman that in her 20s, Joyce had a good job, New Jersey Telephone, but had become addicted to cocaine. And suddenly she had lost her job, she had disappeared. They heard, years later, that she's homeless and living on the streets of New York City. Whatever Joyce was addicted to, whether it was cocaine or some other drugs, her real problem was that. And it looks like she eventually got into group Narcotics Anonymous. She did get some kind of treatment. One of the things we heard from her around age 53, she described herself as formerly homeless. She was living in Brooklyn. She still thought that Project Help was political psychiatry, where she had been a victim. When Mayor Koch heard that, he claimed that claim by her itself showed that she was crazy and should be committed. Shortly thereafter, Joyce had a stroke at the age of 58 in 2005. She died. Mayor Koch followed her about 8 years later, and he died in 2013. This case, I think, shows two things. One, the danger of labels, especially by people who really don't know the patient. Labeled schizophrenia can be very dangerous. We'll later see when we talk about genetic testing how labels like cancer can be very powerful and make people sick long before they have symptoms. So we want to be careful about these labels. The second problem occurs with how we feel about homeless, mentally ill people living on the streets. We know a lot of studies have shown that most homeless people who are mentally ill also have some kind of substance abuse problem, whether it's alcohol, heroin, fentanyl, a lot of different methamphetamines. So it's really hard to get them treated. Something structural happened in the last 20 years. It's called the deinstitutionalization. And that is basically the courts decided that if you're going to commit people against their will and they haven't committed a crime, that you have to give them some kind of treatment or let them go. There was a very famous decision in my home state of Alabama where Bryce Hospital had been committing people for years and they're really getting very little treatment. And Judge Frank Johnson said in Wyatt versus Stickney, if you don't give these people some minimal treatment, you have to let them go. What is minimal? Minimal is pretty minimal, like one psychiatrist for every 125 patients, which even then Alabama hadn't met. A lot of people got released from mental institutions, and the idea was, and it was a benevolent idea, that they'd be better off treated in communities and shelters. Unfortunately, NIMBY occurred, N-I-M-B-Y, not in my backyard. Many communities resisted having a shelter for homeless people, for mentally ill people, for people with substance abuse problems, but didn't want it anywhere near their kids, their neighborhood. A lot of those shelters never got made. We see the city's still flooded with people. They're unhoused, to use the politically correct word, and struggling. Philosophically, there's a deeper problem. We think that people like Joyce Brown would be happier living in a shelter. Joyce Brown argued otherwise, and many other people on the streets feel the same. It's kind of like the problem of other minds. I think everybody else has a mind like myself. They could be robots. I can't get inside their head to feel what they feel. We think that homeless people would be better off involuntarily committed where they have clean sheets and good food. If they don't feel that way, are we really right to impose this on them? One of the ACLU lawyers argued there are rich people in India living on the streets because they don't want to pay rent. As we move forward in time, the problem of mentally ill homeless has continued, especially in New York City. There was a man on the Staten Island ferry with a sword who was very violent. There was a man named Larry Hogue on the Upper West Side who was violent. And most famously, there was a couple mentally ill people who pushed people to their death in front of oncoming subways, including a woman named Kendra. And New York State passed Kendra's law after this case, which allowed city officials to involuntarily medicate people who appeared on the verge of violence because of their mental illness, temporarily medicated. Nevertheless, the problem has probably intensified. Mayor Bill de Blasio tried to do a similar program as Project Help and get people off the streets. Later, Mayor Eric Adams actually revived Project Help and tried to use the same logic that people are better off in shelters and they're dangerous to themselves living on the streets. But unfortunately, over this time, fewer psychiatrists are willing to treat homeless people for free, and the number of spaces in state institutions has dwindled. So it's much harder to get people treatment that they need. And plus there's been, a structural inequality has grown about housing in this country. There just aren't enough houses and rentals available for very poor people. We are stuck with this problem. That's it for today. If you enjoyed the story, I hope you learned from it. If you did, give me a thumbs up, and even better, subscribe. Thank you.